the ballroom smelled like roses and champagne, and I was standing under a crystal chandelier worth more than my entire college tuition when my mother leaned in, smiled at a table full of guests and said, "This is Lily, our other daughter." Then after a pause just long enough to sting, she added, "You know, the less pretty one." And they laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough for it to land exactly where it was meant to. And I stood there in a dress I bought on clearance for $79 while my sister Chloe glowed across the room in a custom gown that cost more than my car. And in that moment I realized something I should have understood years ago. This wasn't just a joke, it never had been. This was a role they had written for me a long time ago. And tonight, in front of 120 guests, they were making sure I stayed in it, but what they didn't know was that they had already handed me the one thing that could break it, a microphone, and I hadn't decided yet what I was going to do with it, not until that exact moment when I saw the way my father raised his glass to Chloe, the way the room leaned toward her like she was the center of gravity, the way I faded into the background like I always had, like I was designed to, and I wish I could say this was new, that this was the first time they called me that, but it wasn't. They'd been calling me the ugly one for as long as I can remember, quietly at first, then casually, then publicly, like it was just another fact about me, like my height or my age, something fixed, something undeniable, something not worth questioning. And when you hear something like that enough times from the people who are supposed to define you, it starts to settle into your bones. It shapes the way you stand, the way you speak, the way you exist in a room. I learned to stay at the edges, learned to laugh when they laughed, learned to make myself smaller so Chloe could shine brighter. Because Chloe was perfect, Chloe was the investment, the one they poured everything into: private school, dance lessons, a car at 16 with a red bow on top, and now this, an $85,000 wedding that looked like it belonged in a magazine, every detail curated, every moment staged, every guest carefully chosen to witness her perfection. And me, I was there too, technically seated at table 12 near the back, introduced when necessary, useful when convenient, invisible the rest of the time, and for a while I convinced myself that was enough, that being included at all was something to be grateful for, that maybe tonight would be different, maybe this was their way of finally seeing me, of letting me step into the light for once. But then the rehearsal dinner happened, and I watched my father stand up, tap his glass, and tell a story about Chloe's childhood, about how she used to play dress up and declare she'd have the most beautiful wedding someday. And then he looked at me, smiling like it was harmless, and said, "And Lily, well, she always preferred to stay out of the spotlight." And the table laughed again, and I smiled again, and something inside me quietly shifted again, because that wasn't the full story, not even close. But I didn't correct him, I never did, not back then. I just sat there and let them define me in front of strangers who nodded like they understood, like they knew exactly who I was based on a few carefully chosen words. And maybe they did, maybe I had made it easy for them. Maybe I had spent so many years accepting that version of myself that I forgot there was another one they had never bothered to look for, one I had been building quietly, piece by piece, far away from this room, far away from their expectations. And the truth is, by the time this wedding came around, I wasn't the same person they thought I was anymore. But they didn't know that, not yet. And as I stood there under that chandelier, holding a glass of champagne I didn't even want, listening to the music swell and the laughter echo, I realized something else, something that made my hands steady. For the first time that night, they had spent $85,000 to create a perfect story for Chloe, but stories can change in a single moment, especially when the wrong person gets the microphone, and I didn't realize then just how much that moment was going to cost them. The next morning started earlier than I expected, not because I could not sleep, but because I had already been awake for most of the night, replaying every moment from the rehearsal dinner in my head, every laugh, every glance, every subtle reminder of where I stood in this family. And by 7:30 a.m., I was already at the venue again, walking through rows of white chairs lined up perfectly on the lawn overlooking the water, the kind of view people travel across the country to see, the kind of view Chloe always said she deserved. And as I adjusted a ribbon that had come loose on one of the aisle markers, one of the wedding planners approached me with a clipboard and a polite smile and asked if I could help coordinate the seating chart because there had been a last-minute change, and I nodded without hesitation, because that is what I have always done. I help, I fix, I stay useful, because being useful was the only way I knew how to exist in this family without being questioned. And within minutes I was moving place cards, answering questions, directing vendors, blending into the background of a day that was not mine but somehow still required my effort to run smoothly. And at some point my mother walked by, glanced at the chart I had just corrected, and said, "Good, at least you are doing something important," like it was a compliment, like it was the highest role I could possibly earn. And I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I had learned not to need more than that. But something in me resisted that thought this time, something small but steady like a voice I had been ignoring for years, and I tried to push it down as I always did, but it did not go away. It just waited, quiet and patient, the same way I had been for most of my life. And by the time guests started arriving in the afternoon, the entire place had transformed into exactly what Chloe had envisioned: soft music drifting through the air, servers carrying trays of champagne, guests dressed in tailored suits and silk dresses, and I watched from the edge as people greeted my parents with admiration, complimenting them on how stunning everything looked, how perfect Chloe was, how lucky they must feel. And I saw the way my father stood a little taller with each compliment, the way my mother smiled like she had personally designed every detail, and I realized that this was not just Chloe's moment, it was theirs too, proof that they had built something worth showing off, something worth celebrating, and I knew exactly where I fit into that picture. I was not part of the display, I was part of the setup, and for a while I moved through the crowd quietly, refilling glasses, answering questions, making sure everything stayed flawless, because if something went wrong, I knew it would somehow become my fault. It always did. And then just before the ceremony began, Chloe found me near the back entrance, her makeup perfect, her dress catching the light in a way that made everyone stop and stare, and she smiled at me, not unkindly, but not warmly either, just enough to acknowledge my existence, and she said, "Can you do me a favor tonight?" And I said yes before she even finished the sentence, because that was the pattern, and she handed me a small card with a few notes written on it and said, "I might be too emotional to speak, so if they ask, you can say a few words about me, just keep it light, something sweet, nothing too long." And I nodded again, holding the card in my hand like it was just another task, just another responsibility I had been given. Without question, but as she walked away, I looked down at what she had written, a few generic lines about childhood memories and sisterly love, things that sounded good on the surface but felt hollow underneath, and I realized that even in this moment, even in the one chance I had to speak, they had already decided what my voice should sound like, what my role should be, what version of me they were willing to accept. And I felt that same quiet shift inside me again, stronger this time, harder to ignore, because I was not that person anymore, not the one who would repeat their script just to keep the peace, not the one who would smile and stay small while they defined me in front of a room full of people. And as the ceremony music began and everyone took their seats, I slipped the card into my purse, not because I planned to use it, but because I needed to remember exactly what they expected from me. And I did not realize then how important that small piece of paper would become later that night. The ceremony itself was everything Chloe had ever wanted: soft piano music drifting through the speakers, sunlight catching the edge of her veil as she walked down the aisle, every guest rising to their feet like they were witnessing something rare and perfect, and I stood off to the side near the last row, just outside the frame of every photograph, watching it all unfold exactly the way my parents had planned. And as Chloe reached the altar and my father placed her hand into someone else's, I saw the look on his face: pride, relief, validation, like this moment confirmed every decision he had ever made about which daughter mattered more. And I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, just steady, like something I had carried for so long it had become part of me. But this time it did not sink me the way it used to. This time it just sat there waiting, like it knew something I was only starting to understand. And as the vows were exchanged and the guests smiled and wiped away tears, I found myself thinking back to a very different room, a much smaller one, 3 years earlier, where no one was dressed up and no one was watching, where I sat alone at a desk with a second-hand laptop that overheated every 40 minutes, trying to figure out how to build something for myself without anyone noticing, because by then I had already learned that if my family saw potential in me, they would either ignore it or redefine it until it fit their narrative. So I stopped showing them anything at all. I stopped asking for support. I stopped waiting for approval. And I started working in silence, late nights, early mornings, taking online courses, rewriting drafts, practicing presentations out loud in an empty apartment until my voice stopped shaking, because somewhere along the way I realized that the one thing they never expected from me was competence, real undeniable competence, the kind that did not rely on appearance or charm or family connections, the kind that could stand on its own if given the chance. And I found that chance in places they would never look: small consulting projects, freelance contracts, opportunities that came from strangers who did not know me as the ugly one, people who only cared about results. And for the first time in my life, I was evaluated without the weight of their expectations, and it changed something fundamental in me, something I did not fully recognize until much later, until moments like this, standing at the edge of my sister's perfect wedding, realizing that the version of me they had spent years defining was no longer the only version that existed. And as the ceremony ended and the guests began to move toward the reception area, laughter returning, music shifting, the entire atmosphere relaxing into celebration, I followed at a distance, still holding on to that small card Chloe had given me earlier, still feeling the edges of it pressed against my fingers like a reminder of the role I was supposed to play. And when we reached the reception hall, everything was even more elaborate than before. Long tables covered in white linen, centerpieces of imported flowers, a stage set up at the front with a polished microphone waiting under a spotlight, and I could already hear the murmur of anticipation, the expectation that there would be speeches, that there would be moments where people would stand up and say exactly the right things to reinforce the story everyone had come to celebrate. And I knew my part in that story. I knew what they expected me to say: simple, harmless, forgettable, something that would make Chloe look even better, something that would keep me exactly where I had always been. But as I took my seat at table 12 again, watching my parents move from guest to guest, soaking in every compliment, every nod of approval, I felt that quiet voice inside me growing louder, not angry, not reckless, just clear. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had avoided for years. What would happen if I did not follow their script? What would happen if I told the truth, not the exaggerated version, not something dramatic, just the truth they had spent years pretending did not exist? And the thought alone was enough to make my heart race, not from fear exactly, but from something unfamiliar, something that felt a lot like control, and I did not realize then how close I was to using it, not until I saw the event coordinator walk onto the stage, tap the microphone, and begin announcing the order of speeches for the night. The room quieted just enough for the microphone to carry every word clearly as the event coordinator smiled and welcomed everyone to the reception. Her voice polished and effortless, the kind of voice that knew exactly how to guide a room full of people toward the emotions they were expected to feel. And I watched as she introduced the first speaker, Chloe's maid of honor, who stepped onto the stage with a practiced smile and a speech that hit every predictable note. Stories about childhood, laughter, admiration, the kind of words that made guests nod and clap at all the right moments. And then came my father, who adjusted his suit jacket, took his place behind the microphone, and looked out over the crowd like he owned the room, like he had built not just this event but the entire narrative surrounding it. And his speech was exactly what I expected. A carefully curated version of our family history where everything centered around Chloe, her achievements, her beauty, her future. And when he mentioned me, it was brief, almost an afterthought, a passing line about how every family has different roles, followed by a soft chuckle that the room echoed without hesitation. And I felt the weight of those words settle in the same place they always had, except this time they did not sink me. They clarified something. They confirmed that nothing about this night was accidental. Every word, every glance, every introduction had been designed to keep me exactly where they believed I belonged. And as the applause faded and my father returned to his seat, my mother leaned toward one of the guests and whispered something that made them both smile, and I did not need to hear it to know what it was. I had heard variations of it my entire life. And then the coordinator returned to the stage, her smile unchanged, her tone still warm, and she began listing the remaining speakers, each name met with polite applause, each person stepping into their assigned moment. And I could feel my pulse begin to shift, not faster exactly, but more deliberate, more aware, like my body was preparing for something my mind had not fully decided yet. And then I heard it, my name, clear and unmistakable. And now Lily Bennett, the bride's sister, would like to share a few words. And for a split second the room turned toward me all at once, 120 faces, some curious, some indifferent, some already expecting something light, something forgettable, something that would fit neatly into the story they had been given all evening. And I felt the edges of that small card still in my purse, the script Chloe had written for me, the version of myself they were comfortable hearing. And I stood up slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel the moment fully. Every step from table 12 to the front of the room, every second of silence that stretched just long enough to make people lean in slightly. And as I walked, I noticed things I had not seen before: the way the light hit the stage, the way the microphone stood waiting, the way my parents watched me with a kind of relaxed confidence, like they had already predicted exactly what I was going to say. And when I reached the steps, I paused just briefly, enough to steady my breath, enough to recognize that this was the point where everything could stay exactly the same or change completely. And I climbed up one step at a time until I was standing behind the microphone, looking out at a room that had never really seen me, not fully, not honestly, and I could feel the weight of years pressing against this single moment, every label, every dismissal, every quiet acceptance of a role I had never chosen, and I placed my hands lightly on the podium, not gripping it, not holding on, just steady, and I pulled the card from my purse, glancing at the neat handwriting, the safe words, the expected tone, and for a second I imagined reading it exactly as written, letting the night continue without disruption, letting everyone leave with the same story they arrived with, and it would have been easier than anything else I had done that day. But as I looked up again, meeting the gaze of people who had already decided who I was, I felt that quiet voice inside me rise to the surface, no longer patient, no longer waiting, just clear, and I realized something that made everything else fall into place. They had spent years telling me who I was, but they had never once considered what I might say if I decided to answer. And I did not realize then just how quiet the room was about to become when I finally did. I picked up the microphone and for a moment I said nothing, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted them to sit in that silence, the kind of silence that makes people shift in their seats, the kind that makes them realize something is not following the script they expected. And I could feel every eye on me, my parents watching with calm confidence, Chloe smiling faintly like this was just another predictable part of her perfect night. And I looked down at the card one more time, the safe version of me written in neat handwriting, the version that would keep everything intact, and then I folded it slowly and set it on the podium without reading a single word. And I heard it, a small change in the room, not loud, just a shift, like people leaning forward without realizing they were doing it. And I took a breath and said, "Hi, I am Lily," simple, steady, no apology in my voice. And for the first time that night, I did not introduce myself the way they expected. I did not add context, I did not soften it, I just let my name stand on its own, and I saw a few people glance at each other like they were trying to recalibrate, trying to understand why something so small felt different, and I continued, "I was asked to say something sweet tonight." And I let that word hang for a second, not mocking it, not rejecting it, just acknowledging it. Something short, something easy, and I smiled. Slightly, not for them, but because I finally understood how small they had expected me to be, and I said, and I could do that, because it was true. I could have given them exactly what they wanted. I had done it my entire life. And for a moment I let that possibility exist in the room. I let them believe that was where this was going, and then I said, "But I do not think that would be honest." And the room went quieter, not dramatically, just enough for every word to land a little heavier. And I felt my hands steady on the podium, not gripping, not shaking, just there, present, and I looked directly at Chloe, not with anger, not with accusation, just with clarity, and I said, "Growing up, Chloe was always the beautiful one." And there were a few soft chuckles, the kind that come from recognition, from familiarity, because that was the story they all knew, and I nodded slightly like I agreed with them, like I was part of that same understanding, and then I added, "And I was always the other one." And this time the laughter did not come as easily because I did not say it like a joke, I said it like a fact, the kind that people do not know how to respond to when it is said out loud. And I could feel the room shifting again, people adjusting, listening more carefully now, and I continued, "That was not just something we said at home." And I paused just long enough to let that settle. That was something that followed me everywhere. And I saw my mother's expression change slightly, not panic, not yet, just a flicker of awareness that this was not going to stay comfortable. And I kept my voice even controlled because this was not about emotion, not anymore. Family dinners, holidays, birthdays, there was always a version of that story being told. And I glanced briefly at my father, who was watching me now with a different kind of focus, like he was trying to understand where this was going, and I said, "And after a while you start to believe it." And I let that line sit because I knew how it sounded, simple but heavy, and I was not raising my voice, I was not accusing anyone directly, I was just describing something that had always been there, something everyone in that room had either participated in or quietly accepted. And I could see it in their faces now, the recognition, the discomfort, the realization that they were not just watching a speech anymore. They were witnessing something real, something that did not fit neatly into a celebration. And I took another breath, feeling that steady control settle deeper, and I said, "So tonight I could stand here and tell you how perfect Chloe is." And I nodded toward her, acknowledging the truth in that statement, because she was in many ways exactly what they said she was. Or I could tell you how beautiful this wedding is, how everything came together exactly as planned. And I gestured lightly around the room, the flowers, the lights, the carefully arranged perfection. But I think everyone here can already see that. And then I looked back out at the crowd, letting my gaze move across the faces, not avoiding them anymore, not shrinking, and I said, "What you cannot see is what it costs to build a story like this." And that was the moment I felt it shift completely, not just the room but something deeper, something irreversible, because I knew once I said that, there was no going back to the version of me they understood. And I did not realize then just how much of that cost I was about to make them confront. There was a pause after I said it, not long, just enough for the words to settle into the room like something unfamiliar, something people were not sure how to react to yet, and I did not rush to fill it. I let it sit there because for once I was not trying to make anyone comfortable, and then I continued, my voice still steady, still calm. It costs more than money. And I glanced briefly at the decorations, the flowers, the lights, the details everyone had been admiring all night. It costs attention, it costs validation, it costs deciding over and over again who gets to be seen and who does not. And I could feel the shift now more clearly. Guests who had been smiling a moment ago now watching more carefully, more quietly, like they were starting to understand that this was not just a speech, this was something else entirely. And I kept going, not faster, not louder, just clearer. When you hear something about yourself enough times, especially from the people who are supposed to know you best, it starts to shape the way you see everything. And I let my eyes move briefly toward my parents again, not accusing, just acknowledging. You start to believe that maybe they are right, maybe you really are less important, less noticeable, less worth investing in. And I could see my mother shift slightly in her seat now, her smile no longer steady, her posture a little more rigid, and my father's expression tightening just enough to show that he was paying attention in a different way now. And I continued. And the thing is, once that belief settles in, it does not stay in one place. And I tapped my fingers lightly against the podium, not for emphasis, but because it grounded me. It follows you into every room, every conversation, every opportunity you either take or walk away from. And I could feel my heart beating a little stronger now, not from fear, but from the weight of saying something that had been unspoken for so long. And I said, I spent a long time thinking that my role was to stay out of the way, to make things easier, to support the version of this family that everyone else could celebrate. And I let that line sit because I knew how familiar it sounded, how easy it was for people to accept. And for a while I thought that was enough. And I nodded slightly, like I was acknowledging my own past without judgment. But at some point you start to ask a different question. And I paused again, just long enough to draw their attention back in. What happens if that story is not true? And I saw it then, the confusion in a few faces, the curiosity in others, the subtle tension building in the room. And I kept my voice even, not pushing, not forcing, just guiding. What happens if the version of you that people have been repeating is not the only version that exists? And I let my gaze move across the room again, slower this time, making eye contact where I could, not looking away, not shrinking. And I said, because the truth is, while all of this was happening, and I gestured lightly around the room again, the wedding, the celebration, the story being told, I was building something else. And I could feel the shift deepen now, the attention sharpening, people leaning in slightly without realizing it. And I continued, not loudly, not publicly, not in a way that anyone here would have noticed. And I smiled faintly, not with bitterness, but with clarity. But it was real. And I let that word land because it mattered. More than anything else I had said so far. It was mine. And I could feel the difference now, not just in the room but in myself, the way the words felt as they left my mouth, not defensive, not reactive, just certain. And I said, and the reason I am standing here tonight is not to take anything away from Chloe. And I looked at her again, holding her gaze for a moment, steady, not hostile, because this is her day, and she deserves to be celebrated. And that was true, and I let it be true. But I am also not going to stand here and pretend that the story you have all been given is complete. And that was the line that changed everything, because once it was said, it could not be taken back. And I could see it now, the way the room had fully shifted, the way the expectation of a simple speech had disappeared, replaced by something heavier, something more honest, something that did not fit neatly into a celebration. And I took a breath, steady and controlled, and I said, because there is a part of that story that has never been told. And I paused just long enough for the weight of that to settle in every corner of the room. And I think it is time it was. The words stayed in the air longer than I expected, not because they were loud, but because no one interrupted them, no one laughed, no one tried to redirect the moment back into something lighter. And I could feel the room holding its breath in a way that made everything sharper, clearer, like even the smallest sound would matter now. And I did not rush, I let that silence work, because for once it was not something I needed to escape from. It was something I could use. And then I continued, my voice still controlled. I used to think that if I just worked harder, if I stayed quiet, if I made myself useful enough, eventually things would balance out. And I shook my head slightly, not dramatically, just enough to show the shift, that eventually I would be seen the same way. And I let that idea sit there for a moment, because I knew how many people understood that kind of thinking, how easy it was to believe in it. And I added, but that is not how it works. And this time there was no pause after. I let the words move forward, steady and deliberate, because when a story gets repeated long enough, people stop questioning it. And I glanced briefly at the guests, not accusing them, just including them. Even people who are not part of your family start to believe it too. And I could see it in their faces now, that recognition, that discomfort, the realization that they might have been part of something they never fully examined. And I continued, so I stopped trying to change that story for them, and I let my hands rest lightly on the podium again, grounded, present, and I started building something for myself instead. And I saw it then, the curiosity shift into something deeper, something more focused, because now they were listening for something different, something they had not expected to hear tonight. And I said, I did not announce it, I did not ask for support, I did not even talk about it at family dinners. And I smiled faintly, not out of humor but out of clarity, because I already knew how that conversation would go. And a few people shifted in their seats, the tension no longer subtle, and I continued, I just worked. Simple, direct, undeniable. Late nights, early mornings, taking opportunities wherever I could find them, learning things no one taught me, figuring things out without anyone guiding me. And I could feel the rhythm of it now, not rehearsed but real, each word landing exactly where it needed to. And for the first time I was not being measured against someone else. And I looked at Chloe again briefly, not blaming, not accusing, just acknowledging the contrast that had always been there. I was being measured by what I could actually do. And I let that distinction sit because it mattered, because it was the line that separated who I had been from who I had become. And I said, and something interesting happens when that is the case. And I paused just long enough to draw them in again. You start to see yourself differently. And I could feel it now, not just the room shifting, but the weight of years lifting in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. You start to realize that the version of you that people repeat is not always the most accurate one. And I let my gaze move across the room again, slower this time, more intentional. Sometimes it is just the most convenient one. And that line landed heavier than the others. I could feel it in the way people went still, in the way no one moved to interrupt or redirect, and I continued. And the problem with convenient stories is that they are easy to maintain. And I tapped the edge of the podium. Lightly, not as a gesture but as a grounding point, until something challenges them. And I let that word sit for a second, challenge, because that was what this was now, not a speech, not a moment, but a disruption of something that had been accepted for far too long. And I said, and tonight I realized something. And I could feel the shift inside me again, not uncertain anymore, not hesitant, just clear. I realized that I do not need to fit into that story anymore. And I let that line stand on its own, because it was not for them, it was for me. And then I added, and I also realized that if I keep staying quiet, that story does not just stay the same. And I paused just long enough for them to lean in again. It becomes permanent. And I could see it now, the full attention of the room, the expectation replaced by something else entirely, something that did not belong to the event anymore. And I took a breath, steady, controlled, and said, and I am not interested in being permanent in a story that was never true to begin with. And I did not realize then just how much that one sentence was about to change, not just how they saw me, but how they would have to see themselves. For a moment after I said it, no one moved, not Chloe, not my parents, not the guests who had spent the entire evening nodding along to a version of reality that suddenly did not feel as stable as it had an hour ago. And I could feel that shift settle deeper now, not just discomfort but awareness, the kind that makes people replay everything they have heard and seen through a different lens. And I did not rush to break it. I let them sit in it, because for once I was not trying to make this easier for anyone else. And then I continued, my voice still calm, still measured. The truth is, I am not standing here tonight because I finally found the courage to speak. And I let that line hang for a second because it sounded like it could go in 100 different directions. I am standing here because I realized something much simpler. And I looked down briefly at my hands, steady, grounded, before looking back up again. Silence does not fix anything, it just protects the version of the story that benefits the people telling it. And I saw it land, not loudly but clearly, the way people shifted slightly, the way a few glances were exchanged across tables. And I continued, and for a long time I thought protecting that story was my responsibility. And I gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth of that without judgment. I thought that if I stayed quiet, if I played my part well enough, it would keep everything together. And I gestured lightly around the room again. The decorations, the perfect arrangement, the illusion of harmony. But what I did not understand then is that keeping something together is not the same as making it right. And I could feel the room leaning into that distinction now, the difference between appearance and reality becoming harder to ignore. And I continued, because when you build something on a story that leaves someone out, that something is never actually complete. And I paused just long enough to let that settle. It just looks complete from the outside. And I let my gaze move across the room again, slower now, more deliberate, meeting eyes without hesitation. And I said, "And tonight this looks perfect." And I nodded slightly toward the space around us, the lighting, the flowers, the carefully curated details. It really does. And I allowed that truth to exist without contradiction because it was real, but it was not the whole picture. But perfection does not mean honesty. And that line shifted something again deeper this time because it challenged not just the event, but the foundation it was built on. And I continued, "And I think we all know that, even if we do not always say it out loud." And I saw a few expressions change, subtle but undeniable, the kind that comes from recognition rather than surprise. And I took a steady breath, feeling the moment settle into something more controlled, more intentional, and I said, "So I am not here to ruin anything." And I looked at Chloe again, holding her gaze for a moment, not hostile, not apologetic, just clear. "I am here because I finally understand that being part of a family does not mean accepting a version of yourself that was never fully yours." And I let that line stand on its own because it was not just about me anymore, it was about something broader, something more universal. And I continued, "And I also understand that people do not always realize the impact of the roles they assign to others." And I glanced briefly at my parents, not accusing, just acknowledging the pattern. Sometimes it feels harmless, sometimes it feels like a joke, sometimes it feels like tradition. And I paused, letting each word land with the weight it carried. But over time it becomes something else. And I let that thought settle before finishing it. It becomes identity. And I could feel the room fully with me now, not resisting, not interrupting, just listening. And I said, "And once something becomes identity, it shapes everything that follows." And I tapped the edge of the podium lightly again, grounding myself in the moment. What you believe you deserve, what you think you can become, what you allow yourself to reach for. And I let my hands rest still again, steady, present. And I continued. And for a long time I limited all of that based on a story that was given to me, not one I chose. And I let that line sit because it mattered, because it was the core of everything I had been building toward. But that is no longer the case. And I could feel it now, not just in the room but in myself, the certainty, the clarity, the shift that had been forming quietly for years finally becoming visible. And I said, "And once that changes, everything else has to change with it." And I paused, just long enough for them to feel the weight of that statement, because it was not just a reflection, it was a turning point. And I did not realize then just how clearly that change was about to reveal itself to everyone in that room. By now the room was completely still, not the kind of silence that comes from politeness, but the kind that comes from people realizing they are witnessing something they did not expect to be part of. And I could feel that awareness settling into every table, every glance, every quiet shift in posture. And I let it stay there for a moment before continuing, my voice steady, controlled. "The part of the story that has never been told is not dramatic." And I shook my head slightly, keeping my tone grounded. "It is actually very simple." And I let that simplicity carry because it mattered more than anything else. I was never less. And I did not raise my voice, I did not emphasize it. I just said it the way a fact is said, the way something undeniable is stated without needing approval. And I saw it land immediately, not as a shock, but as something people had not considered in that exact way before. And I continued. I was just never given the same space to be seen. And I let my gaze move across the room again, slower now, deliberate, making sure the words connected where they needed to. And when that happens over and over again, it creates a version of reality that feels true, even when it is not. And I could see it in their expressions, the subtle recalculations, the quiet recognition, the discomfort of understanding something too late. And I kept going, not pushing, not rushing, just letting each line build on the last. And I am not saying this to blame anyone. And I glanced briefly at my parents again, not to accuse but to acknowledge their place in the story, because I think most of us do this in ways we do not even notice. And I nodded slightly, including the room in that truth. We label, we compare, we simplify people into versions that are easier to understand. And I paused just long enough to let that idea settle. And then we forget that those versions are not complete. And I could feel the shift deepening now, not resistance, not denial, but something closer to reflection. And I said, "But here is what I learned." And I let that line draw them in again, because now they were listening for something more, something that would explain why this moment mattered. When you are not being seen the way you actually are, you have two choices. And I held that space for a second, letting the weight of that choice register. You can spend your entire life trying to convince people to change their minds. And I let that option sit because I knew how familiar it was, how exhausting it sounded even without saying more. or you can build something that does not depend on their perspective at all. And that was the line that shifted everything again, not just the room but the direction of the entire moment, because now it was no longer just reflection, it was movement, it was action, it was something they could not reduce to a feeling and move past. And I continued. And I chose the second option. Simple, direct, undeniable, and I could feel the attention sharpen again, the curiosity rising, because now they were starting to understand that there was more behind this than just words. And I said, I chose to stop waiting for permission to be valued. And I let that line stand because it mattered more than anything else I could say. And I started creating value in places where no one had already decided who I was. And I could see it now, the realization forming, the quiet question building in the room. What does that actually mean? What did she do? What have we missed? And I let that question exist for a moment before continuing. And over time something changed, and I kept my tone even, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear. Not because anyone here suddenly saw me differently. And I glanced briefly at my parents again, acknowledging that nothing about this had come from them, but because I started seeing myself differently. And I let that distinction land because it was the core of everything, the shift that made this moment possible. And once that happens, you do not go back. And I paused, just long enough for that truth to settle in every part of the room, because it was not negotiable, it was not reversible. It was not something that could be undone by a single conversation or a single reaction. And that is why I am standing here tonight saying this out loud. And I could feel it now, the full weight of the moment, not just in the room, but in the way my words carried, without resistance, without hesitation, not to change the past. And I shook my head slightly because that was never the goal, but to make sure it does not define the future. And I did not realize then just how much that future was about to look different for everyone in that room, not just for me. For a brief moment after I said it, there was nothing, no applause, no laughter, no polite reaction to guide the room back into something comfortable, just a stillness that felt heavier than anything that had come before. And I stood there without rushing to fill it, because this time I did not need to soften what had already been said. And then I continued, my voice steady, grounded. And when you stop letting the past define you, and I paused just long enough to let that line settle, you also stop needing approval from the people who created that version of you in the first place. And I could feel the shift again, deeper now, because this was no longer just reflection, it was separation, it was a boundary being drawn in real time. And I saw it in my parents' faces, the way my mother's expression tightened, the way my father sat a little straighter, like he was trying to reassert control over a moment that had already moved beyond him. And I continued, not louder, not faster, just clearer. And that does not mean you stop caring. And I let that distinction land carefully because it mattered. It just means you stop shrinking to fit expectations that were never built for you. And I could see it now, the understanding beginning to form in places it had never been allowed before. Not just in the guests, but even in Chloe, who was no longer smiling the same way. Her expression more focused, more aware, like she was hearing something she had never fully considered. And I went on. For a long time, I thought being part of this family meant accepting whatever role I was given. And I shook my head. Slightly, not in frustration but in clarity. But I understand now that being part of something does not mean disappearing inside it. And that line shifted something again, subtle but undeniable, because it challenged a belief that had been quietly reinforced all night. And I continued. And the reason I am saying this here tonight is not because this is the easiest place to say it. And I glanced briefly around the room, the guests, the stage, the carefully built celebration. It is actually the hardest. And I let that truth stand because it mattered more than anything else I could add. But it is also the most honest. And I could feel the weight of that honesty settle into the space between us, not as tension anymore, but as something more grounded, more real. And I said, because if I can say this here, in a room where I have spent most of my life being defined a certain way, and I paused just long enough to let that context fully land, then I know it is not something that depends on the room changing. And I could see it now, the realization building, the understanding that this was not about convincing anyone, it was about something much more internal, much more permanent. And I continued, it means I have already changed. And that line carried differently, quieter but stronger, because it did not ask for agreement, it simply existed as truth. And I let it sit there for a moment before adding, and once that happens, the way people see you can catch up, or it can stay the same. And I gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, not dismissive, just accepting. But either way, it no longer determines what you do next. And I could feel the room fully with me now. Not resisting, not interrupting, just listening. And I said, and what I do next is not going to be shaped by a label that was given to me when I was too young to question it. And I let that line land clearly because it was the boundary, the line that separated everything before from everything after. It is going to be shaped by what I have already built, what I have already proven to myself quietly, consistently, without needing anyone here to notice. And I could feel it now, the shift. Reaching its peak, not explosive, not dramatic, but undeniable, the kind of change that does not announce itself loudly, but becomes impossible to ignore once it is visible. And I took a steady breath, grounding myself in that clarity, and I said, and that is something no one can take away by repeating an old version of who I used to be. And I did not realize then just how much that statement was about to force everyone in that room to reconsider not just me, but the entire story they had accepted without question for so long. The room did not move after that, not even a chair shifting or a glass being lifted, and I realized in that stillness that something had already changed in a way that could not be undone, not because I had raised my voice or forced anything dramatic, but because I had said something simple and true in a place where that truth had never been allowed to exist before. And I let that moment breathe before continuing, my voice quieter now but somehow carrying further. I think the hardest part about all of this, and I paused just long enough to draw their attention back in, is not what was said. And I let my gaze move briefly toward my parents again, not accusing, just acknowledging the history that sat between us. It is what was never questioned. And that line landed differently, heavier, because it shifted the focus from a single moment to a pattern, something ongoing. Something everyone in that room had been part of in ways they might not have realized, and I continued. Because when something becomes normal, people stop looking at it closely. And I nodded slightly, including myself in that truth. I did too. And I let that admission stand. Without defensiveness because it mattered. I accepted it, I adjusted to it, I built my life around it. And I could feel the weight of that honesty settle into the room, not as tension but as recognition, and I said, and that is why it lasted as long as it did. And I let that line sit because it explained more than anything else I had said so far. Not because it was right, but because it was repeated. And I could see it now, the realization moving across faces, the understanding that repetition can create truth where there is none, and I continued, but repetition only works if no one interrupts it. And I paused again just long enough to let that idea fully land, and tonight I am interrupting it. And I did not say it with defiance or anger, I said it like a statement of fact, something already in motion. Something that did not need approval to continue, and I could feel the shift deepen again, not outwardly but internally, the kind that changes how people process everything that comes next. And I went on, not to create conflict, and I shook my head slightly because that was not the goal, but to create clarity. And I could feel that distinction matter because it separated this moment from something chaotic, something reactive, and grounded it in something intentional, something controlled. And I said, because clarity does not always feel comfortable. And I let that line settle, because everyone in that room could feel it. But it is necessary if anything is going to change. And I could see it now, the way the room had fully shifted from passive listening to active reflection. The way people were no longer just observing but thinking, reconsidering, connecting things they had not connected before. And I continued, and I know this is not what anyone expected to hear tonight. And I allowed a small, almost neutral smile, not apologetic, just acknowledging the reality of the moment. But I also know that sometimes the most important things are the ones we do not plan for. And I let that idea sit because it reframed everything that had happened so far, not as disruption, but as something necessary, something that had been waiting for the right moment. And I said, and if there is one thing I have learned over the past few years, and I paused again, drawing them in without effort now because the room was already with me, it is that you do not need a perfect setting to speak honestly. And I glanced around the room again, the decorations, the carefully constructed celebration. You just need a moment where you decide that honesty matters more than comfort. And I could feel it now, the full weight of that decision, not just in my words but in the way they were being received, in the way no one interrupted, no one redirected, no one tried to pull the moment back into something easier. And I said, and once you make that decision, everything else starts to align around it. And I let that line stand because it was not about convincing anyone, it was about stating something that had already become true. And I added, including the way people listen. And I could see it clearly now, the difference between how they had been listening earlier in the night and how they were listening now, the shift from expectation to attention, from assumption to awareness. And I took a steady breath, grounding myself again in that clarity, and I said, and that is why this moment matters. And I let that line carry, not loudly but with certainty, not because of where we are or what this event represents. And I gestured lightly around the room one more time, but because it is the first time I am speaking from a place that is entirely my own. And I did not realize then just how much that ownership was about to change not only how they saw me, but how they would have to respond to everything that came after. By the time I finished that sentence, the room no longer felt like a celebration in the way it had an hour ago. It felt like something more honest, more exposed, like the surface had been peeled back just enough for people to see what had always been underneath. And I could feel that shift not as resistance, but as something quieter, something more reflective. And I let that moment settle before I continued, my voice steady, grounded. And the reason I am sharing this here, in front of all of you. And I paused, letting my eyes move across the room once more, not avoiding anyone, not shrinking, is because this is where the story was always the loudest. And that line carried differently, not sharp but undeniable, because it pointed to something everyone in that room had participated in simply by being present. And I continued. This is where it was repeated, reinforced, accepted without question. And I let that pattern sit there, not accusing, just visible now. And if it can be said out loud here, then it does not have to stay the same anymore. And I could see it in their faces, the understanding that this moment was not just about me, it was about something larger, something that extended beyond this family, beyond this event. And I went on. Because the truth is, most stories like this do not change because someone at the center decides to rewrite them. And I shook my head slightly, acknowledging that reality without bitterness. They change when someone who has been defined by them decides to step outside of them. And I let that idea settle because it mattered, because it explained everything that had led to this moment. And I said, and that is what I am doing. Simple, direct, no hesitation. And I could feel the clarity of that statement land in a way that did not require explanation. And I continued, not by asking for permission, not by waiting for agreement, but by choosing something different for myself. And I let my hands rest lightly on the podium again, steady, present. And I know that might feel unexpected tonight. And I allowed a small neutral expression, not apologizing, just acknowledging the reality. But it is not sudden. And I paused just long enough for that to register. It has been building for years. And that line carried weight because it reframed everything. It showed that this was not a reaction, not an impulse, but the result of something consistent, something intentional, something real. And I continued. Quietly, consistently, without needing validation from the people who had already decided who I was. And I could feel it now, the full attention of the room, the kind that comes when people realize they have missed something significant right in front of them. And I said, and that is the part of the story no one here has seen. And I let that line land fully because it was the missing piece, the part that made everything else make sense. Not because it was hidden, but because it was never looked for. And I could see it now, the recognition in their expressions, the understanding that absence of attention does not mean absence of value. And I continued. And I am not sharing it tonight to prove anything. And I shook my head slightly because that distinction mattered more than anything else. I am sharing it because I no longer need to prove it. And I let that line stand because it carried a different kind of weight, a finality that did not ask for response. And I said, because when something is real, it does not depend on whether or not it is acknowledged in a room like this. And I could feel the shift reach its fullest point now, not dramatic, not explosive, but complete, the kind of change that settles into place and cannot be undone once it is seen. And I took a steady breath, grounding myself in that clarity, and I added, and that is why this moment matters more than any label that was ever given to me. And I let my gaze move one last time across the room, not searching, not seeking approval, just present. Because this is the first time I am defining myself out loud, without adjusting, without filtering, without fitting into something that was never mine. And I did not realize then just how clearly that definition was about to change not just how they saw me, but what they would remember long after this night was over. For a moment after those words left my mouth, there was no reaction, not even the kind people give out of habit, no polite applause, no nervous laughter, just a stillness that felt complete, like something had reached its natural end without needing anything added to it. And I stood there, not waiting for approval, not expecting a response, just allowing the moment to exist exactly as it was. And then I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to the room, not to my parents, not even to Chloe, but to myself, because I understood something clearly for the first time. This was not about winning anything, it was about no longer participating in something that had never been true. And I stepped back slightly from the microphone, my hands no longer resting on the podium, my posture no longer shaped by hesitation, and I said one final thing, my voice softer now but still carrying, I hope tonight is everything you wanted. And I looked at Chloe as I said it, not with resentment, not with comparison, just with a kind of Distance that had not been there before because for the first time her story and mine were not competing for the same space, they were simply separate, and I meant it in a way that did not require her to understand what had just happened, and then I added, and I hope going forward we all pay more attention to the stories we repeat. And I let that line sit for a brief second, not as a lesson, not as a warning, just as something to consider. And then I stepped away from the microphone. Completely not rushing, not lingering, just moving forward. And as I walked down the small set of steps from the stage, I could feel the eyes on me again. But they felt different now, not measuring, not dismissing, just watching, and I did not look away, I did not lower my gaze. I walked straight back through the room the same way I had walked up, steady, deliberate, present, and when I reached the floor no one stopped me, no one interrupted, no one tried to redirect what had just happened into something more comfortable, because there was no easy way to do that anymore. And I returned to my table for a moment, not to sit, but to pick up my bag, the same bag I had carried in earlier, the same one that held the folded card I never used, and I glanced at it briefly before closing it again, because it no longer had any meaning, and as I turned toward the exit I passed my parents' table, and for a split second, I saw my mother open her mouth like she was about to say something, but no words came out, and my father, who had spent the entire evening controlling every detail, sat completely still, like he was trying to process something that did not fit into the structure he understood, and Chloe was looking at me too, not smiling, not upset, just quiet, like she was seeing me without the usual context for the first time. And I did not stop, not because I was avoiding them, but because I no longer needed to pause for their reaction, and I continued walking past the tables, past the lights, past the version of the night that had been carefully built to look perfect. And when I stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, clearer, like something had shifted not just in the room behind me, but in me, in a way that could not be undone, and I paused for a second near the edge of the walkway, not to look back, but to take in the quiet, the absence of noise, the absence of expectation, and I realized something that made everything else fall into place. Nothing had been taken from me tonight, nothing had been lost, because what I had gained was not dependent on that room, on that event, or on anyone's reaction. It was something I had already built long before I stepped onto that stage. Something that existed whether or not it was acknowledged, and as I walked toward the parking lot, the sound of the reception slowly fading behind me, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was simply the point where I stopped carrying a version of myself that had never belonged to me in the first place, and I did not realize then just how much lighter everything would feel once I left it behind.